hybrid situation in the fall. If we're still going to be doing remote and some in-class, what does that mean for the frequency of PT, OT, special services? How do I bring a healthy, safe place for our students to provide those services? So as we get better and we learn, let's take those lessons learned, the discussion today, and actually be able to provide some input to state ed, our other partners around in other states, to say, hey, we've learned this, and this is where we're heading. So I welcome the conversation for today and look forward to it.
Thank you. Cindy, one question popped up. Does the Reimagine Advisory Group have representation by an expert in special education?
So we could have another whole Zoom session on the composition of the governors of Reimagine. No, but nor were we. So when the governor first announced the educators who were going to be on the Reimagine Advisory Council, there were teachers, there were school board members, there were a host of others, but principals were not on it. We worked with them to provide a way to provide our input, and that was last night. I did hear on that last night when they were addressing it, that they are going to bring in stakeholders from special education to also provide input to it. So even though there were no one on the council, they're going to seek that kind of information from auxiliary stakeholders coming into their sessions.
Thank you. Also, Christopher Sikora asked a question that some of you may have. He said, is there a PowerPoint? I'm not seeing it on the screen. Just to answer Christopher's question, we do not have an overall PowerPoint up for these conversations. Our panelists may reference some of their own slides to support their discussion, but Christopher, you're not missing anything. There is no one big PowerPoint guiding this conversation. So in case some of you were wondering that. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Phyllis, and I have to say how happy I am that Phyllis is here today. During this experience, I've been trying to learn as much as I can about everything related to education as it could relate to our work here in New York State. And I've been checking in frequently on webinars, which are excellent, from both NAESP and NASSP. I can't say enough about the quality of the learning that's available there. And on two of them, NAESP had a special education panel. Phyllis was on that panel. I watched it. And then I watched NASSP, and Phyllis was also on that panel. And I really could see how valuable it would be if Phyllis could join us here on one of our conversations. So I just reached out to her out there in Missouri, and she was kind enough to say, sure. And that's really one great thing about the kind of work we're all doing now. So Phyllis, I'm so glad you're here. And I'm going to ask you, if you can, to just give us an overview from a federal or national perspective, from your perspective, on what you think is most important for our school leaders here in New York State to be aware of.
Well, first, let me say thank you, Karen. Thanks for the kind words on the webinars. We have been working very hard here in the case office virtually with our leaders from across the nation, local directors who are putting their heads together to try and make sense of the number of things that we're required to do and how we do them under these circumstances. I couldn't agree more.
All right, guys, I have to hop on to another meeting, but I will come back in a little bit and see if you all are still here. And if you're not, I wish you a wonderful rest of your week, okay?
Not sure who that is.
So you want EJ and Lillian?
Lily has the link, so she's trying. I think she's having some technical difficulties.
Michelle, I think someone is not muted. Okay, thank you. Let's get back to Phyllis.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say I couldn't agree more with Cindy's comments. I think she did an excellent job of also identifying where we are in the nation with some of the issues that we're dealing with. But one of the and on the case website, and I would encourage you, we have posted them where it's free to anyone, not just our members. We have conducted approximately 7-8 webinars over the last 2.5 months, just talking about all of the issues around special education. And if you're needing some more information, please go access those. But we really began our journey and our thinking around how do we manage and how do we navigate special education during this time of COVID-19 and the crisis that we're in during these unprecedented times. And we really began our conversations and our talking and our guidance around 4 priorities. And that's in the slides, and thank you for bringing that up. I just wanted to share with you our thinking, which we think applies to wherever we are in our process, whether that was at the very beginning when schools were totally closed and trying to figure out what they were doing up until the time where maybe full-on virtual distance learning was occurring. And we looked at things as a continuum. So we said, first and foremost, it is important to focus on the safety and the health, the welfare of students and staff members in your communities. We know that we need to be following the guidance of the CDC. We have to be following the guidance of your state leaders. Governors have made a lot of requirements or set those orders out that we must follow. And then you come down to mayors in our communities and our local superintendents. So we have to be aware of what all of those are when we're following those safety and those health guidelines for all of our students, and how important that was and needed to be at the top of our thinking with everything else that we did. The second priority that we really focused around was faith. We know under the IDEA we had the provision of the requirement to provide a free and appropriate public education to our students. And we had to look at where we are, what our circumstances are. We have to deliver services to as many students as we reasonably can in the best way that you know how. Our thinking around that went to the most recent court case of Andrew. And what we know in Andrew is that it said a school district must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to progress in light of the child's circumstances. So one of the focuses that we had to really zoom in on is, what are the circumstances under which you're providing faith? And that was so important because in some instances, what we know is that parents are saying, no services right now, I can't handle it. We have a survey that's up on our website right now if you wanted to take it. But most recently, we asked, do you have parents who have requested a delay in the timeline? And in our survey, we've had 73% say, yes, parents have requested delays. We've also asked the question, have you had parents request an IEP meeting to consider services? And we said yes, 50% of them said yes, we want them, 50% said no, we don't. So we have to look at the circumstances under which we're trying to provide these services to our students and understand the situation that our families are in at the same time. The third priority that we have talked about and talked about extensively that we think is very important is documenting your efforts around the circumstances that you find yourself in. Making sure your documentation is focused, it's consistent, it's detailed, and it truly demonstrates that good faith effort to provide good services to the students in which you're serving. The fourth priority that we continue to talk about and continue to try and navigate what those issues are as they arise daily and weekly is around the whole compliance aspect of IDEA. Because what we know first and foremost is that the IDEA was not written with any type of national pandemic in mind, where we had stay-at-home orders. We know that timelines are very difficult right now to follow. We know that holding meetings is very difficult to follow. We know that conducting evaluations is not an easy task, if at all, a task that we can take on at this point in time. We also know that there continues to be a lot of confusion in the field around extended school year services. What does that look like? Should every student be considered for ESY? We think no, that's not appropriate, although we have seen some guidance come from some attorneys and some advocacy organizations that says every child should be afforded ESY. But that's not normal. The whole issue of compensatory education has come up. But should we be offering compensatory education? I would remind you that we need to stick to what the requirements are of the IDEA. If we're not careful, we'll break our system with trying to determine that everybody gets everything they've always had. I would like to also remind you of what compensatory education truly is. First and foremost, compensatory education is not a requirement. It's not a statutory requirement. It is not written in the IDEA. It's not a regulatory requirement. So there is no requirement from a compliance standpoint that says you must consider compensatory ed. Compensatory education is defined and has come about through court cases, through those legal remedies when a school district has denied faith. And in this situation, it's not the school district that might have denied faith in any way. It is the circumstances under which we find ourselves with regards to the COVID-19 virus. So all that being said, Karen, I'll just kind of bring it to a close and say, lots is happening. We know that the IDEA is one of the most complex federal laws that we deal with in our nation. And you'll also find on our website where cases advocated, not for waivers, because we believe that our students with disabilities and our parents still should retain all of those procedural rights that they have. But we do need some flexibilities. So we have asked for very narrow, very targeted, and very temporary flexibilities around timelines and some procedures, as well as some financial and fiscal responsibilities, those more specifically involving maintenance of effort requirements. So I would just bring, that's a lot in a short amount of time, just to throw that out to you. But also, as part of the slides that I submitted, that's in one of our webinars that you can access, are some do's and don'ts around each of the priorities that we listed. They're very brief, discussed again more in depth in our webinars, but we have a do and don't on the slides that we've provided for you around each of the 4 priorities.
Thank you, Phyllis. And Phyllis referenced the slides that follow the 4 priorities. They will be posted and available, linked to the recorded version of this panel. And I found them very, very helpful when Phyllis shared those on the NAESP and ASSP webinars, and you might find them helpful too. Before we move forward, I just want to go back to Phyllis for a minute because many of our attendees are not special educators by background. We have building leaders and many other roles who come to these. So we just get back to that idea, very important idea of compensatory education again, and tell us what that might actually sound like in an ask in terms of something that we may actually hear when schools are back. What might a request for compensatory sound like?
Well, I think that depending on what happens in your district, what your environmental situation is, some parents may come right out and ask for compensatory education. You owe me this, or my child is owed this. And I think the way we have, not I think, but I know, the way we have shared and talked about this situation is to say, we are not talking about a denial of faith, but what we are talking about is what do students really need right now. We know in March when our schools closed where our students were performing and what how they were progressing on their goals. Hopefully we have documentation and we know the progress that students have made during this time, or maybe lack thereof progress that they have made during the time that schools have been closed. So we're really encouraging IEP teams to look at where are you when you reconvene that IEP team? Where are you when you go back to school? What does the student need? Some students may need more than what they needed prior to our schools closing. Some students who have continued their virtual education because they were receiving virtual services maybe before, whether that was some of their therapy services or some of our high school students that were receiving some online learning, engaging in coursework. Some of those students might need nothing more, and some of them might need even less if they've made progress on their goals during this time. They had great instruction at home. They had parents who had time, who weren't working at home as well as teaching at home. So all the circumstances are very different. And we just really encourage those IEP teams, take a look at where the student is at the time you're making decisions and determine, do they need more? Do they need less? Do they need the same? And try and not break our systems by thinking about providing an hour for every hour missed or a day for everydayness, because we just can't think through how that could even be humanly possible.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a great time to go over to Chris. Christopher, maybe you can bring us closer to home and walk us through priorities and really foremost current considerations and standards right here in New York State.
That's great. Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to clarify. First of all, Cindy and Phyllis, thank you for setting the stage perfectly for me to say much, because we pretty much covered many of the key areas. And just for the audience, when Phyllis refers to IEP teams in New York State, that's our committees on special education. In case you were wondering if there was what the IEP team was, she was referring. That's the federal term. For New York, that's our CSE, which would have that function around compensatory services. So I just will be very quickly on bringing this down to a New York State level. Everything Phyllis talked about is really what we took from the federal government right at the onset of those school closures. The information that they initially laid out to us and formed what we called our primary, our priority 2 standards. These are the federal standards that we have to work with districts, work with our programs, work with families on ensuring that they understand that because very, very much right out of the gate, our governor, through executive order, required COVID-19 school closure plans. So every district submitted initially one. Everybody has resubmitted and updated COVID-19 school closure plan. Those plans identify how you're providing child nutrition, how you're providing childcare, and there was this, it was a new term at the time, but it's become part of our normal language, which is continuity of learning. What is your plan to provide educational services and instruction to students during school closure periods? So, and right out in the front of this, it wasn't an option not to be providing education in New York State. So right away, our first standard really became, what the federal government was saying. If you're providing educational services to all students, which we are in New York State, you have to ensure equitable access to students with disabilities to that very same learning and continuity of learning that you're providing to all students. So that first standard was real clear on working with districts to understand that you now need to think about access for students with disabilities, which means what programs and services, what supports, what accommodations, what modifications are you going to apply to students with disabilities so they can equitably access that learning environment or environments that you're providing to all students. So right out of the gate again was access. The other standard that we were really clear from the federal government was that FAPE needed to occur. Remember, we had no waivers to IDEA requirements. We had no federal waivers to any of the Part 300 special education regulations. So we were in a position of looking for flexibility, and the federal government did provide some flexibility in the language they gave us. And you can see flexibility around FAPE. It's still required. We have to ensure our students with disabilities are receiving education, but it was through the lens of the health and safety conditions of the situation we were dealing with in New York State. How do we provide FAPE, ensuring that we are protecting the safety of our students, their families, their parents, as well as the staff providing those services? And in New York State, that safety protection, that health and safety protection, was we were not going to be providing face-to-face, in-person instruction to students. Schools were closed. So we then had to figure out what would FAPE look like under those conditions. And the federal government, was early on, was clear that IEP services needed to be provided, and of course as part of FAPE. But those IEP services, districts would have to be implementing IEP services to the greatest extent practicable, to the greatest extent possible. So again, something that districts really had to figure out. You didn't have to change and amend IEPs to reflect services during COVID-19 school closures. You had to take what was an IEP developed under normal school conditions and figure out for all of your students with disabilities, how do you do that to the greatest extent possible? And that is really the way you would be ensuring FAPE during a COVID-19 school closure period. So access and FAPE and the delivery of IEP services are those two main standards hit the field running as far as the state education department perspective, getting around to the regions and having these conversations with staff around what that would look like. Again, no waivers to the requirements of IDEA or the regulations. So again, we continuously work with districts on what does that mean? What it means to many of the points that, Cindy and Phyllis are making. CSE process still moves along. You have to have meetings. How those meetings look will be different. We'll be doing more video and telephone to ensure you're able to meet CSE timelines, and flexibility built in there. If parents don't want if parents don't want a remote meeting, they really want their child's CSE meeting to occur face to face, well then there's the flexibility to delay that until school reopens. Same for evaluation timelines. All of those requirements are still in place. So your initial evaluations, your reevaluations, all are moving forward per the the timelines that you're supposed to get those things done under regulation. However, there's flexibility. If a parent, the flexibility was that you could provide these evaluations remotely, and when you couldn't, and an evaluation had to be face-to-face, the district could then delay that evaluation until school reopened. So again, no waivers to the requirements, but the federal government was quick to respond with flexibility in their guidance and their language. So we in New York State took hold of that and really worked with districts to provide that technical assistance around how you make this happen, of recognizing the extreme challenges. Just think about it. Special education is already complex and challenging to provide under normal conditions to ensure equitable access and faith. Put it under these health and safety conditions, and we have the extreme challenges that we're all facing and trying to figure out. So I can only reinforce, and I'll probably do it through the question and answer session, but how you're documenting what you're doing is going to be critically important to all the areas we talked about. It's going to be your documentation of how you provided access, how you provided faith, and you're going to need that progress monitoring documentation to make those decisions that Phyllis was referencing around, compensatory services and or eligibility for extended school year services, which is right at our doorstep. We need to be making those decisions now as districts. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Karen.
Thank you. You may have already answered this in another form, but I will ask you Charles' question that just came up in the chat. Would it be possible to have a moratorium on litigation against schools as a result of COVID-19?
Is that a question specific to me or Phyllis?
You or Phyllis. Take it. I'm throwing the ball out there.
I can speak to, we have asked, because we are now thinking about, the potential due process, the potential litigation. We're already seeing in other states. We're anticipating, a definite increase in the number of requests for impartial hearings in New York State. We are already the leader in requests for impartial hearings in the nation. So we know the environment in which we provide special education in New York State, and at times it can be very litigious. So we are anticipating an increase in that. Is a moratorium on litigation and due process requests a possibility? Sure, anything's possible. Do I see that happening?
How are you going to grouch at me for not sharing this link with you if you didn't attend
look at
this
the
link?
landscape now, there are so limited to requirements of IDEA. So I'm
Good
not,
thing for you, I'm recording it.
this is my opinion, but my
Yep.
gut feeling is they would not be providing
It
flexibility.
actually makes a lot of sense. Like,
parents have.
I enjoy hearing this perspective.
Look at due process through the health and safety conditions.
I recorded it for a couple of the principals in my district.
Students, and again, comes down to
The change in my title was accidental.
during these COVID-19 school closures, and that having to be also when we have asked this of the federal government, lens of
Pam did. I just met with her on a couple other things.
Needs to shift to faith during these health and safety conditions and not hold faith during normal school. So we have asked for that. We have not
almost
received
6,000 more dollars.
that request, but that ask has been made.
All right, I'm going to go back to listening to this because I don't want to rewatch it later.
I would echo everything that Chris just said. One thing that we are doing, both at our state directors, National Association, the National Association of State Directors of Special Ed, along with CASE, we partner with them, we talk weekly with them. We are advocating for as much of the flexibilities that we can receive through IDEA. There are, the timeline piece, as Chris talked to, is one where in which parents will agree to extend those timelines. Outside of that and the compliance requirements, the flexibilities are very few, but we continue to advocate for those for our teachers in the field, so that we hopefully are not going to head down that road due process. But I can't stress enough what Chris has said about the documentation piece under the circumstances and how important that is, that you keep very good records of everything that you're doing.
Thank you. And we're going to focus on that a little bit more before we conclude today. So we heard about a national perspective, a state perspective, but we all know that where this gets real is at the school and district level. And so at this point, Joyce, I'm so glad you're here because I'd like you to share your experience in your own district in central New York and in the contact you have with school leaders across New York State, because we know that through your work with SAANYS and other organizations, you have a lot of contact with other special education leaders across New York State. So maybe you can connect the federal and state dots for us on the local level.
Hello, everybody. Just like you, on March 17th, boots hit the ground, and we had to figure out what March 18th was going to look like. So I have included a PowerPoint of my presentation for you to refer to at another time. I won't go through it all. The first slide just talks about the CSE process, and I know that you've all been involved in that now. We've been 8 weeks into this. So just like you, we became a virtual CSE committee, and we held all our annual reviews. We held 100 annual reviews in the 3 days after the closure was announced. We did a quick training of all our staff. We did pod training so everybody knew how to use Zoom and put information in. So just like you, we had to keep the drums beating when it came to meeting our obligations for compliance, especially when it came to annual reviews, because we know we needed an active IEP in order to make amendments in the future. So hitting annuals was really important. And then we did get a little relief about reevaluations and initial evaluations. But I can't stress enough the importance of the communication with parents throughout this whole process so that they understood what was happening with the referral, what was happening with their students. Because if they understood and worked with us and we can document it and communicate it, I think we're going to come out better on the other side. So the next slide, we just talked a little bit about related service provisions, and just like you probably have got these up and running. We gave parents a choice. We surveyed parents to see if they wanted paper packets of therapy materials or if they wanted to do video therapy, which then it took us some time to make sure Zoom was compliant. So that we could do teletherapy with our students, or we did lesson plans with with modeling videos for parents to be able to access at their own time. But parents were surveyed and they could pick how they wanted the related services. So we did that probably the following week so we could get our related services up and running. The next thing was really figuring out what our service provisions were going to look like. So we separated our models into 2 different models. We have an elementary model and a secondary model. And what we did is we have 11 schools in Elmira City School District. So we had a grade level point person, a general ed point person, and a special ed point person. And we worked in teams and pods to come up with what lessons would look like. And then, Michelle, if you want to go to the next slide. It was really important for us that students' work was labeled according to their services, so that parents could understand that they were still getting the ELA consultant services or the resource room services. Michelle, if you want to go to the next example, that's one of our 12-on-1 classes, so you can see that the ELA folders look different than the math folders, just so parents could see what their services were. So we wanted to be very particular to make sure they were labeled according to the service. So we do those on a weekly basis, and they're also available in paper copy because we know equity was an issue in our district. Not everybody had access to computers. They might not have access to internet. So we also did a parent survey with that to see which mode they were able to access this information. And at the same time, perhaps like all of you, we were handing out devices to kids and training parents about getting on our platforms, and a lot of things simultaneously were happening. But I think it was really important for us to make sure things were labeled clear so parents knew they were still getting those services. I'm going to go to the next slide. The next thing, that's just another example of what, this is the 7th grade example, so you can see that the integrated math lessons. So the parents have access to the general ed, that would be the module 1, and the module 2, and then the integrated work would have their modifications, their accommodations, their specially designed instruction, any resource materials that they would need would be in their lessons. This is what a teacher's view looks like. If you were a special education student, when you clicked on yours, you only saw your stuff, you didn't see everybody else's. So it was really tailored to what their students' IEPs were. Michelle, you want to go to the next one? This one was really important for us. It's this IEP contact log. And again, this is that communication piece that we were adamant that we needed to keep track of what we were doing. So we were able to put our contact logs into our electronic system, our IEP electronic system. We use ClearTrack. I know some of you use IEP Direct, but we put ours right in there so we could connect it to the special education teachers for access. So we did 3 types of contact logs. There's a parent contact log, there's an instructional contact log, and a case management contact log. The parent contact log, I also gave them a transcript. I gave my staff a transcript about what I expected them to be telling parents in these logs, what I needed them to document. So for like the parent contact log, they needed to explain what the services on the IEP were and what they look like now, how they got adapted. If there was IEP goals that we can't measure because of this new setting, they needed to document that with the parents. The instructional log was information regarding how they were differentiating or doing specially designed instruction, or how they helped a student during office hours. So that was just really to document anything that they were doing to implement the IEP. And the case management log I added because that was to work on maybe transition activities, or if a CSE meeting was coming up and we needed to do some pre-planning with parents. So that was just an extra, or if you're talking to community agencies about a student. So that's all those other things that we do as special education teachers. You know, I always say we're a glacier. Everybody sees the 10% that we do. They don't see the 90% under the water. So that case management log was a lot of that 90% under the water. So I provided directions to all my staff and a transcript of what the contact log should look like and the expectation of how often they should be entering this information. Michelle, if you want to click to the next one. That was just my directions I sent out to them. I tried to make it as user-friendly as possible with drop-down boxes that would fill in what type of log it was, who they contacted. I liked it, it was date stamped, so we know when it happened, we know the date that it happened, and then they had a narrative about what the conversation was. So the next one is the next slide. That's just an example of it. So it's the date. Yes, it's active. The student's participating. They have the IEP. What type of purpose was the case management, parent, or instructional log, and then just the comments that they've been putting in regarding all the contacts they have for the parents. So that's our contact log, which my staff loves using. They really appreciate this tool. So the next thing we also did, that's just another example of a contact log. You can go again, Michelle. So the next thing we thought about in regard to this compensatory ed, or what services may be needed for students. I remember like this first Monday of this closure, I sat into a webinar with some law firm from Rochester, and almost threw up when they said, you're going to have to project where would kids be if they were in school. And I'm like, well, if I could do that, I'd be rich and famous with some statistical formula. So I tried to figure out how I could do that. And then we went back and we graphed our IEP goals. So this really helps us in where the student started and where we report on the 4 quarters before the annual review to tell us where the student would be if we were where they are and where they should be 1 year later. So this is really going to give us some nice talking points and take some of the emotion out of what places they may be, about where the trajectory of what they were expected to be and where they currently are. So we also did the crash course on this. Some of my teachers were using this, but now we're all using this, and we're sending them home to parents, and that visual is really powerful. So that was another part of our communication with the the next thing we learned was I needed to let go of the school day and how I was trained to know what it looks like. So when we think about ESY or the fall, I love those questions, but I'm trying to get to June 15th right now and then try to figure out what ESY virtual is going to look like for me, and then start figuring out what fall blended, not blended, in person, not in person will look like. But I really feel all that documentation piece, and one thing I can say about this situation is it really has allowed maximization of collaboration between general ed and special ed. So all the things that we wished for co-planning all these years happened magically like in a week. So I'm really striving to keep these kind of conversations and individualization of students in the forefront and keep best practices in place no matter where we go or what it looks like.
Thank you, Joyce. And those templates are so valuable. Were they created at the district level?
Some were, yep.
Yep. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Phyllis, did you want to comment, on the documentation piece that Joyce shared with us?
Well, I think she's spot on with the documentation, and I think that everybody has their own form with regard to the system that they may be using, whether it's your student information system permits that, or some people are using Google to create that documentation. But I think the key to it, no matter where you do it, is to be sure that you include exactly the circumstances, dates, times, parent information, student information. As Chris talked about, accessibility. One of the things that we know across the nation, and I don't think that New York is different from this, you have some very rural areas where we still have some families that may not have access to devices, or their internet might not have the capability as much as others to connect. So I think we really have to think about documenting all aspects of even our ability to communicate with our parents. And then in some cases where our parents are so overwhelmed, and they may be providing for other family members in the home as well, other than their children, as we have multi-generational families living in the same home, I think those are things to take into consideration when parents are stretched to the limit and can only reconnect. We should document those things as well. And I think when it comes to the due process, I've seen several comments to say, we have this issue, like the timeline issue for evaluations. We're all going to be out of compliance at some level because there's a 100% requirement for that. We have asked, along with NASD, in our request to OSERS and in our request to Congress, that flexibility under those state performance plans be a flexibility as well. We don't want districts to have to be writing corrective action plans around the fact they did not meet a timeline when we know why they didn't. And probably in their last review, they did. So it's using some common sense approach and thinking very thoroughly through every aspect of that documentation.
Thank you. Christopher, please.
Karen, I just wanted to add to the Joyce's patient point is what we have been saying, pretty much I've been out there, and documentation is something I've been stressing to the field for, throughout the closure periods. And what Joyce is an example of is how she operationalized a consistent communication documentation type of protocol across her staff, which is something that, districts, we've been saying from the beginning, it would be to your benefit to work with your staff and not use various different types of, documentation protocols. Really hone in on something that's going to gather that critical information you need around access, delivery of FAPE, delivery of IEP services, and progress monitoring into a format that staff are consistently using across your building. So again, what Joyce has in place is an example of that. So nice job, Joyce.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher, and thank you again, Joyce. I really just want to stop for a minute and say that, once again, in these conversations, we have a short time frame, but the resources are very rich that are connected with the recordings. And this really goes to, I was in on a webinar yesterday that Michael Fullen was facilitating about this time that we're in and what's important. And one thing he was stressing was, we always knew the importance of collaboration. At least we've always heard about it. For as long as we can remember, we've heard about it. We all work on inter-district collaboration. We try to get 3 elementary schools running somewhat on the same track, and that's hard enough. But his point was, this is not just going to be about inter-district collaboration. This is intra. This is bringing districts together to collaborate and share, not just intra, but inter. So one thing we are doing here is, in these conversations, we're sharing resources, and that's a very good thing. So anything that you can do out there in your own individual districts to connect with other districts, share resources, learn from colleagues beyond those who are in your own district, seems to be a very valuable and helpful direction. This is a great example of that kind of sharing. So thank you. Okay, maybe I could ask our panelists, we're going to go to some audience, some attendee questions in a minute, but let's just take a look ahead at the summer.
You called me?
Thoughts about what we might see shaping up, or what we should be thinking about with regard to the summer that is pretty much at our doorstep.
I'll take a stab at it. It was very helpful because a few weeks ago we didn't know how the summer was going to look, and I would meet with districts, and that was the anxiety was clear that are we going to be face to face? Are we going to be remote instruction? Are we going to be a combination of the two? Will my ESY programs switch midstream? Because in New York State we are really like states where our educational system right now is really dependent on language that comes out in the governor's executive order. So I would like our health and safety conditions and for ESY to have been face-to-face this summer, but the reality is the governor made the decision that we're not at that point as a state from a health and safety perspective. So as an entire state, we now know that our instruction during the summer or extended school year and summer programming in general will be done remotely. So that helps districts, I think, with their planning. Again, you're not developing IEPs like remote instruction in your ESY programs. You're still developing an IEP which represents the faith for that student under normal conditions, and you're going to be implementing that IEP, with the same flexibility that the federal government has provided during these school closure periods for the school year. That flexibility, we're at this point still applying to our ESY programming in that you go to the greatest extent possible because of IEPs and provide faith under, the remote instruction, health and safety condition that we're under. So again, that's going to be challenging because we know that our ESY population is typically already a group that, because just by virtue of requiring 12-month supports, they're a group with more intense needs, higher needs than the general population of students with disabilities. And we know that that's one group of students that, if any group of students was struggling during the current school closure, remote instruction, or any other type of alternative mode that was being done, that group is one that we're seeing we're struggling probably more so than others. So we really need to start wrapping our brain around what does remote instruction look like for students that demonstrate significant regression, have significant cognitive disabilities, have significant behavioral concerns or issues or needs, and how do we meet those needs to the greatest extent possible during the summer months, so that when we return to normal conditions and open up and have face-to-face instruction, we have mitigated as much as possible the regression that many of these students are experiencing.
Thank you. There's a question from Roberta a while ago, and I would kind of pitch this out to Cindy or Chris. Is there concern about the lack of special education representation on the Governor's Reimagine Education Committee?
I think I addressed that a little bit, which I can go into a little bit more. But Chris, I think, are you concerned about it from a state ed perspective?
We have, from a state ed perspective, our interim commissioner, Shannon Tahoe, is representing the department and went on that committee. She's a member of that Reimagine committee. So I'm comfortable that special education from a state education department perspective is going to be very well represented through our commissioner, our interim commissioner on that panel. So that I'm comfortable with. Groups that have reached out to me that have expressed interests, advocacy groups of, what they perceive as, not enough representation of individuals and peoples and students with disabilities on that committee. I have been referring them to the executive to voice their concern and bring that to their attention. So Cindy, to your point, that may have led to what you were describing as some possible pulling in groups as that committee moves forward.
Thank you.
Just a quick dose of reality on that. So that advisory council has been formed. I don't think there's any thought of adding any more members to it. So for the participants on this, I would suggest that whoever, remember, state ed is having its own task force, of which the chancellor has indicated that next week she will be announcing who's on that. So there's some time. If you feel that your group should be on that, I would certainly write to state ed on that. And I did, we did participate last night, so I do know that those groups will be interconnecting. So I would just really get your positions in to write into the council or to write into state ed and make sure that somehow, some way, your different opinions or responses or comments would be received.
Thank you.
And to that point, the Board of Regents reopening school task force, special education group that wants or feels they need to be represented on that particular task force. I've been handling that since the beginning, since that was announced. So I will, any group names that come in or individuals that are seeking membership on that task force, I do forward directly to our deputy commissioner for that consideration. So if you have any special education interest groups that are wondering how do I at least voice my desire to be on that task force, they should be sending them. They can send them directly to me.
Thank you. I would note that someone requested other examples of documentation logs, and Phyllis has posted a couple of them in the chat. We can post them on the recorded version as well. Margaret Goodman, would you like to ask your question about remote learning plans? Margaret there? I'll ask it for Margaret.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Margaret. There you are.
So, just wondering if remote learning plans are being done all over New York State, and if that is something that is required.
Can you repeat that question?
Remote learning plans for students with IEPs while we're going through this time of learning from home. Are they being done all over all the counties in New York State? And does that kind of take into account state?
And I'm going to apologize, but maybe Karen, Margaret's on my end is breaking up at some pieces of her question. I missed some language, so can you repeat it?
I believe it is whether or not remote learning plans are required for special education students in state.
At this point, remote learning plans are not a requirement. They are, though, a recommendation, from the federal government, and I cannot say I don't disagree with, that is to me part of the documentation we talk about. When I talk about documenting how you're providing access and how you're implementing an IEP, those are two key factors in the documentation we've been recommending districts keep on all their students. And if you think about it, the documentation of how you're providing equitable access to a learning environment and the documentation of how you're providing IEP services, well, that is documentation. That is the plan of how you're going to be providing that student's services. And in New York, for the summer moving forward, it's right now remote. So how are you going to provide that remote instruction and document that? So you're already taking that documentation of access and delivery of IEP services. To me, that is, pretty much on how you're going to be providing that student with remote instruction. But is
Thank
it
you.
requirement?
We're almost at the hour, but I'm going to throw a couple more questions that are coming up here for the next couple of minutes if you want to remain. If a parent does decline the Regents exam waiver and a student remains in school, will districts be held harmless? Will districts not get slapped for having a non-graduate? In my little district, every student counts as more than 1% of the cohort. If many parents decline, our non-grad rates will go up quickly.
Again, my phone was ringing and I could see it was my boss. So I just hung up on it. So I'll deal with that after this. So can you repeat that?
Okay. If a parent declines the Regents exam waiver and a student remains in school, will districts be held harmless? Will districts not get penalized for having a non-graduate? In a little district, every student counts as more than 1% of the cohort. Many parents decline, the non-grad rates will go up quickly.
So the Regents examination exemption declination memo that went out yesterday, really, Karen, I'll get back on the accountability piece, but that really, the intent there is for a student that was really, I'll speak to the student with disability. That is something that student was already in the works to continue their education. So it's clear from their IEP, it's clear from CSE documentation, that this was a student that was not really, the plan was not for them to exit this June anyway, that it's clear that they were going to continue a 5th or 6th year and moving forward. So, that's, the accountability application would be the same as if that student was going to remain in school anyway for a 5th or 6th year and graduate, after their cohort may graduate. The goal there was to mitigate any students that really their plan was to continue, but because you're eligible because of the Regents examination waiver right now, that, a student's not moved out of school prior to what their plan was really for them. So I'll ask the actual accountability question on how that is going to impact. But again, remember, the ESSA accountability is on hold as well for next school year. So how any of this is tracked and reported is really not going to be, we're kind of freezing the ESSA waiver. I'm sorry, we have an ESSA waiver, which is going to be really freezing that accountability system. But I'm not going to speak too far out of my wheelhouse on that. I can definitely ask that question and get back to the group as far as, how does the Regents exemption declination new requirement that was just released, how will that impact, or will that have any impact on future ESSA accountability? I will get that answer.
Thank you. Question from Ben. We have advocates who are attending meetings telling parents and our CSE teams that if a service was not provided face-to-face via video conference, it does not count. What is the New York State response to this?
I'm going to go back to something Phyllis said about entitlement. And this is not, you're not an entitlement to compensatory services because of your IEP being provided under a different mode or manner during the school closure periods. So, again, the flexibility from the federal government is you're implementing those IEP services and programs to the greatest extent possible. The documentation the district has to make that case is the reason we're saying documentation is so critical. So when you're in that situation and an advocate is saying it didn't occur face to face, it doesn't count, it wasn't fake, it's the documentation you have of how you implemented that IEP to the greatest extent possible that's going to be, critically important in that situation. And if that situation leads to a due process proceeding, you'll have that documentation to show during these health and safety conditions, what was the district's actions to provide FAPE to that student given those conditions. So again, it comes down to that documentation.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One is for Joyce. What platform is Elmira using for those materials you shared?
For the academics, we're using Schoology, and then we use ClearTrack for our progress monitoring of IEP goals and our parent contact line.
Thank you. Nuts and bolts on IEPs. Should a district change the end date on IEPs since schools are closing earlier than anticipated because they provided instruction over spring break? I know an end date is not required on the document, but what should we do if the end date is on the document?
I'll field that one. The end date, again, we'll get guidance out on this, but I can clarify that if you go back to the, I believe it was November 2012, definitely 2012, there's federal guidance on IEP services during, an emergency disaster, which causes a school closing. So in that case, it was Hurricane Sandy. They have reiterated the same language for COVID-19 school closures in that, if you are ending services to all students due to an emergency condition, and COVID-19 is clearly an emergency condition, if you're ending services, there's no expectation that you will continue to provide services to just the students with disabilities. So we are not at this point telling districts to be ending IEP end dates. If you're stopping the education services to all students and consistent with that federal guidance, both in 2012 and again now in 2020, it's saying the same thing. This is an emergency condition. You're closing your school due to health and safety conditions. You're stopping education due to this emergency situation. There wouldn't be that expectation to continue just for students with disabilities.
Thank you. As we bring this conversation to a close, I would just ask our panelists for any parting thoughts they might want to share, or anything that you feel particularly hopeful about going forward.
I guess I'll start. We're really looking at our next step. We didn't really dip our toe into the virtual interaction in classrooms. We really were just putting module work and stuff on IEPs. So I think our next plans is really to look at what virtual face-to-face instruction may look like for some of our services. So we're looking at that. But also, anybody who wants to get in contact with me, you can get my information through SAANYS or on the Elmira City website. We'd be happy to talk with you. As Karen said, I do talk with people across the state. We do have regional meetings. I talk to a lot of directors across the state for special ed, and we really are sharing a lot of good practices. So if you have questions or ideas, just shoot us an email, and hopefully our circles get bigger and we can just network and get through this together.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joyce. Cindy?
Just a quick one. I think we would be remiss not to thank everybody on this Zoom session for all the work that you've been doing. We certainly hear about the heroic efforts that you've all made, and I know that you probably don't hear to the extent that you need to, but thank you. And this has been tough. It will be tough for a little bit longer, but you all are just amazing. So hats off to you all.
Thank you.
I would just add one more thing moving forward. I received today some information about a grant that's available to states and partnering with school districts regarding mental health services. It's a grant program, just came out through the Federal Register today. We know that that is going to be one of the greatest needs for our students moving forward. A number of them is their mental health and social emotional status. And so I think it's a very positive thing that just came out from the Department of Ed through the Office of the Elementary and Secondary Education Program. So they are hearing loud and clear that there are needs for the mental health, the behavioral health of our students moving forward. So that was, I think, a real positive, and we will be, again, it just came out today, so we'll be sharing that with all of our state affiliates and encouraging them to work with their state departments of ed to access these much needed funds.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you so much once again to our panelists and all of our participants for coming today to this conversation. We so hope it has been helpful to you. We think the resources will also be helpful to you. And if there is any specific question that you specifically want to try for me to get answered by one of our panelists, feel free to email me and I will do my best. kbronson@saanys.org. I want to tell you about some coming attractions, all right, on SAANYS Connect. Our next SAANYS Connect will be on Thursday, June 11th at 3 p.m. And that's going to mark the first panel of a 5-part SAANYS Connect summer series entitled Reopening Schools, Planning and Vision. We have a 5-part series starting on June 11th on all aspects of reopening schools here in New York State. The topic for the June 11th panel is First Things First, focusing on health and safety protocols. Information on that panel and those to follow in the series will be posted on the website and sent to you in your SAANYS email. So be sure to open those SAANYS emails. Lots of good stuff in terms of information about all of these coming panels and other kinds of events you won't want to miss. Another reminder, you can find recorded version at www.saanys.org. And for now, we want you to continue to stay safe, and we want to thank you once again, we can't do it enough, for doing this hard and important work for our students and our school community. So thank you, and please keep connecting with us at SAANYS and keep connecting with one another, and have a good evening. Once again, if there's a loose end that I can help you with, don't hesitate to email me. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all of our attendees. We hope to see you again soon. Thanks. Have a great evening.